Ukraine and the United States have just negotiated a 30-day ceasefire for the Ukraine war. There's just one problem. When Russian President Vladimir Putin responded on March 13th, he didn't say yes. And in fact, his answer raises more questions than it answers. The dark truth is that a ceasefire is the last thing that he wants right now. Russia wants to keep the Ukraine war going for as long as possible until it's able to get what Putin really wants: total control over Ukraine. We're going to break down the ceasefire proposal, what's at stake for all sides, and the deeper strategies behind these moves, so stay with us. On March 11th, delegates from US President Donald Trump's administration met with Ukrainian diplomats in Saudi Arabia. The meeting was nearly identical to one his team held in February in Russia at the same location, without any Ukrainian delegates. This time, no Russian delegates were invited. The March 11 meeting was extremely fruitful. Both the US and Ukraine emerged with a ceasefire agreement in hand, with the countries releasing a joint statement to outline the terms of that plan. The ceasefire would last for 30 days, according to that statement, and would involve both sides laying down arms across the entire front line of the Ukraine war. That means no more ground combat, naval attacks, or missile, drone, or aerial assaults by either side. Moreover, the joint statement called for an immediate ceasefire. Some, including the BBC, argue that this rush toward a temporary peace could play more into Russia's hands than Ukraine's. Pressure would be relieved on Putin's forces, but the same can be said for Ukraine's embattled soldiers. Even better for Ukraine was the announcement that the US was going to lift its suspensions on military aid and intelligence sharing. Both had been halted by Trump in the wake of his disastrous meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on February the 28th. The reversal of this decision was a big win for Ukraine because it ensured that up to $2 billion per month of American aid started flowing back into the country. The statement also included a mention of the minerals deal that Ukraine and the US are currently negotiating. Ukraine is home to 22 of the 34 rare earth minerals that the European Union, or EU, classifies as critical. The US wants to get its hands on those minerals, both to reduce its reliance on China as a supplier of these rare earth materials and to profit from the untapped reserves that lie within Ukraine. The ceasefire agreement made no mention of what happens with the territory that Russia and Ukraine occupy. Right now, Russia holds around 20% of Ukraine, while Zelensky's foothold in Russia isn't nearly as strong. Though his forces successfully counter-invaded the Russian oblast of Kursk in August 2024, Putin has been battling to reclaim it ever since, ultimately clawing back much of the lost territory. There was also no mention of American security guarantees for Ukraine in the event of a peace plan being negotiated. Again, that's good for Russia. However, the US appeared to imply that the presence of its civilians in Ukraine, as part of a minerals deal, would be all of the guarantees Ukraine would need. Whether Russia would dare attack Ukraine while American civilians were at work in the country remains to be seen. What we do know is that the 30-day ceasefire agreement offered clear benefits to Ukraine while leaving the door open for Russia to negotiate. The idea seems to be to draw out a response from Putin by placing the ball in his court. Here are the defined terms for a ceasefire. Now it's up to you to respond. And Russia has responded. Initially, Russia held back from providing an immediate yes or no. Kremlin mouthpiece Dmitry Peskov skirted around the issue, as did Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman Maria Zakharova. The latter said that the formation of the position of the Russian Federation will take place inside the Russian Federation. As for Peskov, he told reporters that Russia wouldn't get ahead of ourselves as it was still acquainting itself with a joint statement released by the US and Ukraine. It appeared Russia was not suitably acquainted with that statement. On March 13th, Putin held a press conference in which he said that he agreed to the idea of a ceasefire with Ukraine in principle. However, Putin also claimed that there were plenty of questions that needed to be answered before such a truce could be signed. A ceasefire should lead to an enduring peace and remove the root causes of this crisis, Putin claimed in the press conference before adding, "We're in favor of it, but there are nuances." And it's those supposed nuances that reveal Putin's true intentions. Russia's leader has no desire to agree to a ceasefire, regardless of his claims to be in favor of the truce the US and Ukraine negotiated. To outside observers, the root causes of the Ukraine war seem simple. Putin invaded Ukraine because he wanted to control the country. That is true, but, as Putin says, that statement also misses out on the nuance. To Putin, Russia's invasion wasn't an invasion at all. That's why he gave it the Special Military Operation moniker. Instead, his actions were motivated by a simple fact. Putin doesn't believe that Ukraine should even exist as a sovereign state. At least, it shouldn't exist as a state that's able to operate outside of Russia's orbit. For Putin, marching his soldiers into Ukraine was about retaking land that has always belonged to Russia. Putin has made this position clear multiple times during the Ukraine war. For instance, in November 2023, he addressed Russia's public chamber. During his speech, Putin said, "There was no Ukraine in the Russian Empire." He then went on to restate many of what the Atlantic Council calls the historical distortions he used to justify his invasion of Ukraine in the first place. These distortions include false claims that Ukraine was created artificially by Vladimir Lenin and the early Soviet Union at the expense of southern Russian lands. None of these arguments were new, according to the Atlantic Council. It points out that Russia's president published a 6,000-word essay in July 2021 where he argued that Ukraine was an artificial state. Putin also said that Russians and Ukrainians were one people in that essay. Even as recently as November 2024, European leaders were also telling stories about how Putin views Ukraine. Former EU Commissioner José Manuel Barroso, for instance, says that he held 25 meetings with Putin during his tenure where Russia's leader repeatedly expressed his view that Ukraine doesn't exist as a sovereign state. Putin even added more details, claiming that the country was created by the CIA and the European Commission, according to Barroso. Much of this comes down to an ideological conflict that reveals the true nature of Putin's root cause comments. Russia's leader believes Ukraine shouldn't exist at all. So, when he mentions dealing with the root cause of the Ukraine problem, what he means is that any truce negotiated between the two nations wouldn't be a truce at all. It would be a capitulation. Ukraine would have to confront the root cause of its own existence by ceasing to exist at all as a separate entity from Russia. Putin really wants Ukraine to be part of the Russian Federation. Whether that means Ukraine being absorbed directly into Russia or being diminished into a satellite state that Russia controls is irrelevant. He wants a version of Ukraine that has no prospects of NATO membership, a version that can't strengthen its ties with the rest of Europe or the West. To Putin, Ukraine as a concept needs to go away. A ceasefire would almost be an acknowledgement by Putin that he's fighting a war against another state. That's the antithesis of the goals of his special military operation. This is a fight within Russia in his mind. Any involvement by another country, especially the US, that doesn't benefit his desire to eliminate the root cause of the Ukraine issue will be ignored or twisted until Putin gets what he wants. But it goes even deeper than that. Part of solving the root cause of the Ukraine problem would also involve the demilitarization of the entire country. Right now, Ukraine is fighting against Russia on the back of the largest military buildup in the country's history. According to Global Firepower, which analyzes the strength of 145 military nations every year, Ukraine is now a top 20 military power. Its army has 900,000 active personnel, with a further 100,000 serving in paramilitary forces and another 1.2 million soldiers in reserve. It's also benefited from receiving billions of dollars in military aid from its partners in the United States and Europe. The United States has committed over $120 billion to Ukraine's war effort so far. The ceasefire agreement also means that aid, paused by President Trump after his Oval Office blow-up with Zelensky in February, has resumed and likely won't stop anytime soon. And Europe has gone even further, collectively providing more than $140 billion to Ukraine. In short, a country that Putin believed he could take over in 5 days back in February 2022 has now become the strongest military nation he's ever faced. And he's furious about that. Putin believes that the West, and especially NATO, is using Ukraine as a proxy to fight a war against Russia. That would be bad enough on its own. However, when you couple that with Putin's opinion that Ukraine is part of Russia, it gets even worse for Russia's leader. In Putin's eyes, the West is using Russia to fight against Russia. That's why the root causes comment is so important when it comes to the 30-day ceasefire. Putin is essentially setting out impossible terms for the ceasefire to happen. To properly solve those root causes, Ukraine would have to agree that it ceases to exist. Failing that, Putin would want the entire country to demilitarize, which essentially amounts to the same thing as ceasing to exist. After all, a demilitarized Ukraine is a country into which Putin's forces can march and take over whenever he feels like it. Putin believes that he's negotiating from a position of power, meaning the ceasefire as it stands right now doesn't serve his interests well enough for him to consider signing it. And he may have a point. Remember Ukraine's counter-invasion into the Kursk Oblast in August 2024? That incursion marked the first time Ukraine attacked Russia on its own soil. It was also remarkably successful. By the end of August 2024, Ukraine controlled around 460 square miles of the oblast, which included 93 settlements. A lot has changed since August. With help from thousands of North Korean soldiers, Putin has been engaged in a counter-offensive in Kursk since the end of 2024. As is the case in Ukraine itself, Putin's strategy has been simple: send soldier after soldier in human waves against Ukraine's fortifications to grind out a win. And the strategy is working in Kursk, at least if Russia is to be believed. On March 6, Russia intensified its efforts to retake Kursk in the wave of America's decision to suspend military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine. A day later, Russia's forces attacked Sumy, which is a border region inside Ukraine, for the first time since Putin began his invasion. Russia's goal was to take territory in Sumy so they could encircle Kursk and attack the Ukrainians in the oblast from all sides. With supply lines cut off, those Ukrainian forces have been losing the battle. Russia captured several settlements to the north of the Sudzha, which is the largest town Ukraine claimed during its initial counter-invasion. Now, Russia is claiming to have reclaimed Sudzha, leaving just small pockets of Ukrainian fighters in the territory. As Putin himself put it, when responding to the ceasefire agreement, if a physical blockade occurs in the coming days, no one will be able to leave at all. There will be only two options: to surrender or die. Kursk matters in the context of the ceasefire because it gives Ukraine leverage. If Russia came to the negotiating table before fully retaking Kursk, Ukraine could use the territory it holds to negotiate for the return of the land that Russia occupies in Ukraine. Right now, that's a lot of land. Russia holds about 20% of Ukraine and made gains throughout 2024. Those gains weren't high. Russia claimed just 1,609 square miles of territory at a cost of over 420,000 soldiers. However, the casualties don't matter to Putin. What he sees is that Russia is in a strong position. He wants to stall the ceasefire negotiations at least until Russia can push Ukraine out of Kursk once and for all. When that happens, Ukraine loses one of its most important bargaining chips. It can no longer trade Russian land for Ukrainian land, making it far easier for Putin to say that any ceasefire should come with the condition that Russia keeps hold of the land it's taken. That's another of the supposed nuances Russia wants to introduce into the ceasefire. In reality, Putin isn't looking for answers about what happens with territory. He's simply stalling the ceasefire agreement until Russia is in such a position of strength that Ukraine can't negotiate. And if Ukraine can't negotiate, it's not going to agree to any form of peace Putin offers. That works for Putin too. He can claim that he tried and Ukraine didn't agree. So Russia is being forced to continue waging war because Ukraine is so insistent on its right to exist. It all ties back to Putin's warped view of what Ukraine is. Putin also revealed something else when refusing to sign the ceasefire as it is. He doesn't want to give Ukraine a chance to regroup. That's what he believes he would be doing if he agreed to stop fighting for 30 days. Putin made that clear when he questioned what the ceasefire represents. If we stop military actions for 30 days, what does that mean? Putin queried. Will everyone who's there leave the battle? Putin likely knows that isn't the case. The odds are that both Ukrainian and Russian forces would camp where they are on the front lines without actually fighting with one another. What he means is that 30 days also gives Ukraine a chance to refortify the locations that Russia is currently assaulting. It's 30 days during which Ukraine can prepare defenses, move weapons and soldiers to the regions on which Russia is focusing, and perhaps even prepare counterattacks. That doesn't work for Putin. After all, he believes Russia has the advantage, and with that comes momentum. Beyond Kursk, Putin says that Russia is advancing in practically all areas. While that's technically true, the rate of advance is so slow that the war may as well be at a stalemate. For Putin, any ceasefire would have to come with a guarantee that Ukraine can't use the time to regroup and rearm. What are our guarantees that nothing like that will be allowed to happen? Asked Putin. Again, it's a false question. There's no chance that Russia will not take the opportunity to rearm and regroup during the 30 days. Its expectation that Ukraine should come to a complete standstill isn't mirrored by its own intentions. Again, it comes down to demilitarization. Putin is asking these questions because he knows that the flow of American aid into Ukraine has resumed. He also knows that Europe is still providing aid. And even without all of that, he knows that Ukraine isn't going to de-arm itself as part of the ceasefire. As with the root causes issue, Putin is proposing an impossibility to make it look like he's considering the ceasefire when he really isn't. And he's never going to accept a ceasefire that's in any way fair to Ukraine. That's not just for the reasons we've mentioned, though they're all important. Putin won't stop as he believes that Ukraine shouldn't exist, shouldn't have a military, and shouldn't be afforded any time to regroup. But the real dark truth behind Putin's refusal to ceasefire may boil down to something much simpler. He can't afford to stop the Ukraine war. The Telegraph highlighted Putin's economic problems in a March 2nd piece in which it claimed Putin's president was playing Donald Trump with his claims that he wanted peace. The outlet says that Russia's economy is already creaking under the weight of war. Labor shortages run rampant in Russia. Sanctions are slowly limiting Russia's ability to bring in money through trade. Combine that with high inflation and record interest rates, the Telegraph says, and you get a nation that's on the brink of financial disaster. The only thing staving off that disaster is the very thing that's causing the economic problems in the first place, the Ukraine war. In 2025, Putin will commit 41% of all government spending to the war effort. That amounts to a little over $198 billion, over 4 times what Russia spent on its military in 2019. Russia now has a war economy that accounts for between 8 and 10% of the country's gross domestic product, or GDP. That's a crazy number, as Centre for European Policy Analysis member Alexander Koliander points out. For a country that's waging war not on its own soil, that's a lot, he tells the Telegraph. That wartime economy also paints an inaccurate picture of Russia's economic strength. In 2024, Russia's real GDP grew by 3.6%. That puts Russia well ahead of many other major European nations, including the UK. The Kremlin statistics agency, Rosstat, also says that real wages in Russia rose by 9.4% in 2024. Those numbers paint the picture of economic growth, but the reality is much different. The manufacturing industry, which includes the defense industry, was the only sector that showed growth in 2024, according to Russia-Eurasia fellow Alexandra Prokopenko. And therein lies the economic problem for Putin. A 30-day ceasefire isn't going to put an end to the military-industrial complex he's created in Russia. However, that ceasefire could open the door to more peace talks in the future, which would slow down the wartime economy Russia's leader has created. Putin doesn't want that. He literally can't afford to negotiate any sort of peace that doesn't see Russia claim all of Ukraine, which would also mean getting access to the valuable minerals we mentioned earlier. So he's stalling on the ceasefire. Worse, he's asking questions to which he already knows the answers. Everything he wants from a ceasefire ultimately takes Ukraine closer to losing its fight with Russia. Naturally, Ukraine isn't going to accept. That means Putin will get what he wants in the end, a war that never seems to end. But what do you think about Putin's responses to the 30-day ceasefire Ukraine and the US proposed? Is there any chance he might accept? Or does Putin fear a ceasefire more than the war that he started? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for all of the latest news about the peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, as well as ongoing conflict and military news from around the world. We're a truly independent source striving to bring you the best, most accurate and up-to-date information possible, and we sincerely appreciate your support.